Okay. So you ever feel like American history, like it just kind of came out of nowhere?
Mm,
Today, we're going to trace those ideas back to a pretty surprising source, the Magna Carta.
the Magna Carta.
Yeah, a document from 1215 England.
Wow.
We're going to look at how this like old document could actually have something to do with American ideals.
That's fascinating. I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, and we've got some help with that too. We've got excerpts from a History Hit podcast episode with Dr. Eleanor Yanaga.
Oh, great.
She's a medieval historian.
Perfect for this topic.
I know, right?
So, where do we even begin with this connection between the Magna Carta and America?
Well, it kind of all starts with this huge power struggle back in the day between the king and these barons.
The barons, right? The powerful landowners.
Exactly. And like this led to the Magna Carta being signed.
So basically, they forced the king into this agreement.
Yeah, pretty much not exactly a democracy.
No, not at all. And to be clear, the Magna Carta wasn't about like everyone's rights.
Right.
It was really about protecting the rights of these wealthy barons, not the average person in England.
It's interesting, though, because Dr. Yanaga mentioned that the Magna Carta was like practically forgotten in England.
Really?
Yeah, it wasn't until centuries later that the American colonists kind of dug it up.
And used it to their advantage.
Exactly.
That's clever.
So fast forward to the 1700s, and you've got these American colonists.
Many of them lawyers, by the way.
Oh, right. A lot of them were lawyers.
Yeah.
They were facing all this tension with the British crown.
Yeah, growing tensions for sure.
And they used the Magna Carta to justify like all their complaints.
They were basically like, hey, we're just defending these traditional English liberties that the king's trying to take away.
Wait, so they used this old document about taxes on barons to fuel their whole no taxation without representation thing.
Exactly. They argued that as Englishmen, they deserved the same rights guaranteed by the Magna Carta.
Even though it wasn't originally intended for them.
Right. It's brilliant.
I love how they used the king's own history against him.
Yeah, they really turned the tables.
It's amazing how they took this medieval concept and made it work for them centuries later.
It really speaks to the power of ideas and how they can transcend time.
And it wasn't just about winning legal arguments.
Right.
The Magna Carta became a powerful
It
symbol
was freedom.
of what it meant to be a free Englishman.
And that resonated deeply with the colonists because they saw themselves as inheriting that legacy.
Yeah, it was about tapping into this idea of freedom. The Magna Carta became like a symbol of that.
A rallying cry.
Exactly.
And you can see this connection so clearly in the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, take the Fifth Amendment with its due process clause.
Hey,
It's basically echoing that idea from the Magna Carta that you can't just be thrown in jail without a fair trial.
wow. That's pretty cool.
Right.
So can we like break down some more specific examples of the Magna Carta's influence in early America?
Sure, early American documents like the Virginia Charter of 1606
Okay.
and the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter,
Uh-huh.
they reflect these principles from the Magna Carta. For instance, the Virginia Charter promised settlers the same liberties as those born in England.
So right from the get-go, they were establishing these ideas about rights and liberties.
Absolutely. And you see these ideas even more explicitly in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution.
Give me an example.
Well, like the Sixth Amendment's right to a speedy trial,
Okay.
or the Constitution's guarantee of habeas corpus.
Right.
That's the right to challenge your detention. These ideas all have roots in the Magna Carta.
So just for our listeners, habeas corpus basically means you can't be held prisoner unlawfully. You have the right to go before a court and say, hey, this isn't right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental protection against being unjustly imprisoned.
It's amazing how a document from 1215 could have this huge impact on a nation centuries later.
Really is.
You know, it really highlights how powerful ideas can be.
Definitely. They can transcend time and place.
And it's more than just America. Dr. Yanaga pointed out that the Magna Carta also influenced thinkers in France and other parts of Europe during the Enlightenment. That's right. It seems like the colonists using the Magna Carta kind of renewed interest in it all over Europe.
It sparked conversations about individual rights and limits on government power.
So it wasn't just about America's freedom. It contributed to this bigger movement
Exactly.
with huge implications for the entire Western world.
It's incredible.
And even today, people still talk about the Magna Carta when they're discussing civil liberties and limited government
It's become like this shorthand for a whole set of principles.
that go way beyond any specific historical context.
Exactly. The Magna Carta shows us that history isn't just about events
It's about ideas.
that continue to shape our world even today.
I love that.
It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, but this brings up a question for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how did the Magna Carta a document that was practically forgotten in England,
Right.
become so important for the American colonists?
Hmm.
Was it purely strategic, or did they actually believe in its principles?
That's a great question, and I think it was probably a bit of both.
Okay, I like that.
The colonists, they were smart.
They definitely used the Magna Carta strategically to challenge the British crown.
Right.
But I also think they genuinely believed in the ideals that it represented. Freedom, self-governance limits on the king's power.
Yeah.
Those ideals really resonated with their own experiences and what they were hoping for.
So it wasn't just a legal strategy. It was about ideals that truly mattered to them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why even though the Magna Carta was technically nullified pretty soon after it was created,
What?
yeah,
Really?
it still held all this symbolic power.
It's crazy.
It represented this historical example of limiting the king's power and upholding the rights of the people, even if those rights were pretty limited back then.
It's like they gave this old document a whole new life
They breathed new life into it.
and gave it a power it never even had in its own time.
It's fascinating.
But how did they actually use the Magna Carta to argue for their rights? What specific parts did they focus on, and how did they connect them to their own situation? Well, let's take a look at some of those specific clauses. For example, Clause 39 states that no free man can be arrested or imprisoned without a lawful judgment by his peers or by the law of the land.
That sounds a lot like our Fifth Amendment,
Right.
with its guarantee of due process of law.
Exactly. The colonists used this clause to argue against being arbitrarily arrested and imprisoned by royal officials.
So they saw it as a key protection against tyranny.
Yes, and as a cornerstone of individual liberty.
It's amazing how they connected this medieval concept to their own fight for freedom.
It is. What other clauses did they use? Well, Clause 12 was another crucial one.
Okay, what did that one say?
It stated that no new taxes could be levied without the consent of the General Council of the realm.
Wait, so they used this clause about taxes on barons to support their no taxation without representation protests?
You got it.
That's wild. They basically said, hey, King George, even your ancestors agreed to this.
They argued that just like those barons, they shouldn't be subjected to taxes imposed without their consent, especially since they had no representation in the British Parliament.
So they were throwing the king's own history back at him.
Exactly.
I love it. These examples really show how the colonists saw themselves as part of this long tradition of English liberty.
They were claiming their heritage.
And they weren't afraid to use history to make their case.
They knew their history and they used it brilliantly.
Didn't the Magna Carta also deal with property rights?
Yes, it did.
I vaguely remember learning about how it protected the barons from having their land taken away unfairly.
You're right. Clause 28 stated that no royal official could take grain or other goods from a free man without immediate payment.
That sounds familiar.
It's a fundamental principle of property rights.
And that feels really central to the American system.
Absolutely.
Did the colonists see this part of the Magna Carta as relevant to their situation?
Oh, absolutely. They were very concerned that the crown would try to infringe on their property rights, especially as tensions over taxation and trade were getting worse.
Right.
The Magna Carta gave them historical and legal backing for their argument that property rights were sacred and should be protected from government interference.
So they weren't just fighting for abstract political ideals.
No, they were also fighting for their economic interests and security.
It's amazing how these ideas from a medieval English document became so important to the American identity.
It really shows the lasting power of these fundamental concepts.
It's fascinating.
It is, but it's important to remember that even though the colonists relied heavily on the Magna Carta, they weren't just copying it word for word.
Right.
They adapted its principles to fit their own context and needs.
So they weren't just copying and pasting.
No, they were taking those basic concepts and building on them.
Creating a distinctly American understanding of liberty and government.
Exactly. The colonists weren't just looking to the past, they were using it to build a new future.
I love that. But if the Magna Carta was so important to them, why didn't they just adopt it as their own governing document? Why bother drafting a whole new constitution?
Well, remember, the Magna Carta was very much a product of its time.
Okay.
It was mainly concerned with protecting the rights of barons.
Not the whole population.
Right. And the American colonists, influenced by Enlightenment ideals, wanted a more inclusive and democratic system of government.
So they saw the Magna Carta as like a starting point
A foundation.
to build something new and better suited to their vision of a free and equal society.
Precisely. They took those core principles from the Magna Carta, due process limits on taxation protection of property rights, and expanded on them.
That's incredible.
They wanted to create a system of government that guaranteed these rights for all citizens, not just a select few.
But it still feels kind of puzzling. How did this document that basically formalized feudalism
Right.
evolve into a symbol of democracy?
It's fascinating, right? What's really interesting is that the meaning of the Magna Carta wasn't fixed. Its interpretation changed over time, influenced by, evolving social and political contexts.
That makes sense.
In the centuries after it was created, legal scholars and political theorists started to see it less as a feudal contract and more as a foundational statement of individual rights and limits on government power.
So people were reading their own hopes and aspirations for freedom into the Magna Carta.
Exactly. Even if those weren't the original intentions of the barons who wrote it.
I like that. It shows how much our understanding of things can change over time.
It does, and this reinterpretation gained even more traction during the Enlightenment.
Oh yeah, with thinkers like John Locke.
Exactly. They were developing theories about natural rights and the social contract.
And the Magna Carta fit right in.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
With its emphasis on due process and limits on arbitrary power, it seemed to align perfectly with these new ideas about freedom and government.
It's like the Magna Carta was a blank canvas
Mhm.
onto which people could project their evolving understanding of freedom and justice.
That's a great way to put it. And this adaptability is exactly what made it so powerful.
It could be used to support both conservative and progressive causes.
Depending on how its principles were interpreted.
That's so interesting.
It is. It highlights how historical documents can take on lives of their own, their meanings shifting and evolving as they're reinterpreted by each generation.
So the Magna Carta, going from a feudal agreement to a symbol of democracy, shows how much ideas can evolve and adapt.
Definitely.
It reminds us that history isn't a fixed story
It's an ongoing conversation.
between the past and the present.
We love that.
That's what makes studying history so fascinating.
Absolutely. You're uncovering those layers of meaning and seeing how events and ideas from the past continue to shape our world today.
And speaking of shaping our world,
Yeah.
Dr. Yanaga mentioned how the Magna Carta was even invoked after 9/11.
Really?
Yeah, in debates about government surveillance and civil liberties. It seems like even in our modern world, we're still grappling with those same fundamental questions about balancing security and freedom that were present in 1215 England.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Despite centuries of progress, we're still struggling with these timeless dilemmas.
Yeah.
The Magna Carta reminds us that the fight for liberty is an ongoing process, a constant negotiation between those in power and those seeking to hold them accountable.
So the Magna Carta isn't just some relic of the past.
Right.
It's a living document.
A living document that speaks to the enduring challenges of governance and the constant need to protect individual rights.
It reminds us that freedom is not a guarantee.
It's something we have to constantly defend and reaffirm.
I love that.
It's powerful.
And that leaves us with a thought-provoking question for you to consider. How can we apply the principles of the Magna Carta to address the challenges to freedom and justice that we face today? Where do we see echoes of those medieval struggles in our own time?
It's a question worth pondering.
And how can we ensure that the legacy of the Magna Carta continues to inspire us to strive for a more just and equitable world?
It's a legacy worth preserving.
So the Magna Carta, not just some dusty old document,
Right.
but a touchstone for ideas about freedom and justice that still resonates centuries later.
Absolutely.
It's a story of power struggles, evolving interpretations, and the enduring legacy of ideas.
It's a story that continues to unfold even today.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Where do you see the principles of the Magna Carta being upheld or challenged today?
Let us know.
Let us know. We're
Yeah.
really curious to hear your perspective.
We'll be back next week with more on the Magna Carta and its impact on the world.
Join us then.
It's fascinating how they were able to breathe new life into this old document.
Yeah, and give it a power it didn't even have back in its own time.
Exactly.
But like, how did they actually use the Magna Carta to argue for their rights?
Wow.
What specific parts did they focus on?
Mhm.
And how did they connect those parts to their own situation in the colonies?
Well, let's dig into those specific clauses, like Clause 39, for instance.
Okay.
It states that no free man can be arrested or imprisoned without a lawful judgment by his peers or by the law of the land.
That sounds kind of familiar.
Right.
It's like our Fifth Amendment.
With its guarantee of due process of law.
Exactly.
And the colonists, they used this clause to argue against being like unfairly arrested and imprisoned by those royal officials.
Makes sense.
They saw it as this crucial protection against tyranny.
And a cornerstone of individual liberty.
Exactly.
It's amazing how they connected this like medieval concept to their fight for freedom centuries later.
It is pretty incredible.
What other clauses did they use?
Well, Clause 12 was another super important one.
Okay, what did that one say?
It said that no new taxes could be levied without the consent of the General Council of the realm.
Wait a minute. So the colonists used this clause about taxes on barons to support their no taxation without representation protests.
You got it.
That's brilliant. They basically said, hey, King George, even your ancestors agreed to this principle.
They argued that they shouldn't be subjected to taxes imposed without their consent, just like the barons.
Right.
Especially since they had no representation in Parliament.
It's like they were throwing the king's own history back at him.
They were pretty clever.
I love it. These examples really show how the colonists saw themselves as like inheritors of this long tradition of English liberty.
They were claiming their heritage.
And they weren't afraid to use history to back up their arguments.
They knew their history.
And they used it to their advantage.
Absolutely.
Didn't the Magna Carta also address property rights?
It did.
I vaguely remember something about it protecting the barons from having their land taken away unfairly.
You're right. Clause 28 stated that no royal official could take grain or other goods from a free man without immediately paying for them.
Interesting.
That protection of property rights is a really fundamental concept.
And it seems so central to the American system.
It is.
Do you think the colonists saw this part of the Magna Carta as relevant to their situation?
Oh, absolutely. They were worried that the crown was going to try to mess with their property rights.
Especially with all the tension over taxes and trade.
Exactly.
So the Magna Carta gave them this historical and legal basis for their argument that property rights were sacred.
That they should be protected from government interference.
It's like they were fighting for more than just abstract political ideals.
They were also fighting for their own economic interests and their security.
It's fascinating how these ideas from this medieval English document became so important to American identity.
It's amazing how these concepts have resonated throughout history.
It really is. But it's important to remember that even though the colonists relied heavily on the Magna Carta, they weren't just copying it word for word.
No, they weren't.
They adapted its
It
principles.
fit their own unique circumstances and needs.
They breathed new life into these old ideas.
Exactly.
So they weren't just like copying and
I
pasting.
know. They took those basic concepts and built upon them.
They created this distinctly American understanding of liberty and government.
Exactly. The colonists weren't just focused on the past. They were using it to shape their future.
But if the Magna Carta was so important to them, why didn't they just like adopt it as their own governing document?
That's a good question.
Why bother writing a whole new constitution?
Well, it's important to remember that the Magna Carta was a product of its time.
Okay.
And it was really mostly concerned with protecting the rights of those barons.
Right, not the whole population.
Exactly. And the American colonists, they were influenced by Enlightenment ideals,
So they wanted a more inclusive system.
a more democratic system of government,
They saw the Magna Carta as a good starting point, though.
a foundation to build on.
Yeah, to build something new and better suited to their vision of a free and equal society.
Precisely. They took those core principles from the Magna Carta, like due process limits on taxation protection of property rights.
And they expanded on them.
Exactly. They aimed to create a system of government that guaranteed these rights for every citizen, not just a select few.
It's wild to think that this document that basically like set up feudalism
Right.
could somehow become like a symbol of democracy.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that happened. You know, what's interesting is that the meaning of the Magna Carta, like, it wasn't fixed.
Okay,
Its interpretation, like, it changed over time.
it makes sense.
You know, influenced by all those evolving social and political contexts.
Right.
Like in the centuries after it was first created, legal scholars and political theorists, they started to see it less as a feudal contract and more as like a foundational statement about individual rights.
And limits on government power.
Exactly.
So people were basically reading their own hopes and dreams about freedom into the Magna Carta.
Yeah, even if those weren't the original intentions of those barons who actually wrote it.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It just shows how much our understanding of things can change over time.
It does. And this reinterpretation of the Magna Carta, it really gained traction during the Enlightenment.
Oh yeah, with thinkers like John Locke.
Exactly. They were developing all these theories about natural rights and the social contract.
And the Magna Carta just fit right in.
Perfectly. With its emphasis on due process and limits on arbitrary power, it aligned perfectly with these new ideas that were emerging about freedom and government.
It's like the Magna Carta was like this blank canvas,
Mm.
and people could just project their own evolving understanding of freedom and justice onto it.
That's a great way to put it. And that adaptability is really what made it so powerful. It could be used to support all sorts of different causes, both conservative and progressive,
Oh, wow.
depending on how people interpreted its principles.
So it's kind of like a chameleon.
I like that analogy. It really highlights how historical documents they can take on these lives of their own. Their meanings can shift and evolve as they're reinterpreted by each new generation.
So the Magna Carta, going from a feudal agreement to a symbol of democracy, shows just how much ideas can evolve and adapt over time.
Absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't some fixed story.
Right.
It's this ongoing conversation between the past and the present.
I love that. That's what makes studying history so fascinating.
You're uncovering these layers of meaning.
And seeing how events and ideas from the past continue to shape our world today.
It's an amazing process.
And speaking of shaping our world,
Yeah.
Dr. Yanaga mentioned how the Magna Carta was even brought up after 9/11.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, in those debates about government surveillance and civil liberties.
That's incredible.
It seems like even in our modern world, we're still dealing with those same fundamental questions about balancing security and freedom.
The same questions they were wrestling with back in 1215 England.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it?
It is. Despite all the progress we've made, we're still struggling with these timeless dilemmas.
Yeah.
The Magna Carta reminds us that the fight for liberty, it's not over. It's an ongoing process. This constant negotiation between those in power and the people who are trying to hold them accountable.
So it's not just a relic of the past.
No, it's a living document.
It speaks to the challenges of governing and the need to protect individual rights.
And it reminds us that freedom isn't something we're just given.
It's something we have to constantly fight for and defend.
Beautifully said.
So the Magna Carta, it's not just some dusty old document. It's a touchstone for ideas about freedom and justice that are still relevant centuries later.
It's a story of power struggles and evolving interpretations and the lasting power of ideas.
And it's a story that's still unfolding today.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Where do you see the principles of the Magna Carta being upheld or challenged in the world today? Let us know.
We're really curious to hear your perspective.